everybody. Welcome to a new series with War Hamster Brady and Colonel Towner-Watkins. We are going to be covering the subject of secret societies, but in a much different way than anything that you've seen before. Brady?
I am looking forward to this. We have no idea how many different chapters this is going to take, and because there's a lot to this. There's been a lot of secret societies over the years, and they all tie into this big narrative that you and I have both been working towards. You know, we know what our intelligence agencies do, but we don't always answer well enough why they do it. More importantly, who is calling the shots and giving those orders. And we start talking about the secret societies, I think a lot of those answers are going to become very self-apparent.
I agree. And of course, everyone who follows me knows I use the term international syndicate only because in many cases, the number of secret societies, because they're secret, there could be secret societies we don't even know exist. There's overlapping societies of which some take the lead in one area and what I found out early on is people wanted to, especially the detractors that don't want you talking about the operational aspect of it, they want you to focus and argue about the step one of who's in the syndicate, who's in the secret societies, as opposed to actually talking about how it affects your life today and how it really, understanding the entire network, changes our history completely. And so we've spent a lot of time, like the last year and a half, explaining what the operational aspect of it is. So it is time to transition. And Brady was kind enough to have done obviously not for this purpose, but he has done a lot of research into the secret societies overall. And he's the perfect partner to use that piece of it for me to translate to how it affects today. So I think this is I'm very excited about this.
Yeah, so am I. We've been talking about doing this for a while, so let's get it going. You brought up an important point about a secret society within a secret society, and that's a pattern we'll see over and over again. And we go at Freemasons with the Illuminati. We've seen that. We'll talk about that a bit within Skull and Bones, how you have an inner circle. But what better place to hide than within a secret society? And start with the big question is, why do you have a secret society, and what exactly is one? Well, I was in a secret society. I was in a fraternity in college. It was mostly to chase girls, play sports, and drink beer. But we had our little secrets. But the ones we're talking about today are older, much more serious, and have a totally different and dedicated purpose. But the whole reason you have a secret society is because you were doing things you do not want the outside world to know about.
And do you think, Brady, now that you've mentioned that the whole idea of having fraternities and sororities is a psychological introduction to them not being a bad thing?
To some degree, if you look at the history of the fraternities and sororities, they came after the two big Yale secret societies, which is Skull and Bones and Scroll and I forgot that. How did I forget that one? And those came about in the 1830s. So about 20 years after that, you started to get into Greek fraternities and sororities. Right. So they were like a copycat. And there's if you look at one of the books that Anthony Sutton wrote in the foreword, there's some anonymous Yale wrote probably a 20 verse or 20 stanza poem about how the skull was dominating on campus society, and you needed to stand up to him. This small little group of 15 seniors every year was actually running the school to some degree, or in this guy's words. So I think it was a way to deal with the campus politics at first.
Scroll and Key.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's all along. He's on here and he's on it. Let me tell you, he's an excellent resource.
Very good. Yeah, I should probably be looking at the comments so I can follow that.
Well, I'm not on the Rumble comments. I'm on the StreamYard. He comes in from Twitter, so I see him on StreamYard. But if you want to go to the Rumble one, we can share the duties.
Well, here in StreamYard, I can see, I think both. I think I can see it all, and that works. And I am in the Rumble one, so if I need to post there, I will do so.
Okay.
Yeah, Scroll and Key, I brought that up. There were three big Yale secret societies, and you had the Scroll and Key. and we'll probably do a whole episode on them because they might even be wealthier than Skull and Bones if you look at some of the members in terms of just raw financial power. It's not necessarily political, and there's a difference. And third one was Wolf's Head. And interestingly enough, I have yet to get a reliable list of Wolf's Head members. But
And you know what I find out the most interesting thing when I ran across that name is the Operation Gladio originally being called werewolves.
Yeah, there could be a connection. That's the symbolism is rife throughout the stuff we're going to talk about. And we'll touch on it in a second. But Skull and Bones being a pirate flag, we'll go into more detail. But just so happens one of the co-founders of Skull and Bones at Yale, the Russell family, they made their money in opium smuggling, which will come up over and over again. The drug smuggling, which is rife with these secret societies, but. Before we jump into what these secret societies are, let's talk about what they do. And what we've seen in America, and this translates to Freemasonry to some degree, Illuminati, what have you, but I'm more focused on the Skull and Bones because that's where I've done the deepest research. And probably the best way to explain what they do is, they put their people in bottleneck positions of institutions. And by institutions, we mean the universities, the NGOs, the charitable foundations, and air quotes on charitable, because that's a huge part of the story. The foundations are a big issue. They put their people in the choke points of the State Department. You see them in the CIA. You see them in the military. You most certainly see them in politics. And they put their people in the bottleneck positions, or not necessarily their people, but someone they have influence on. And they do this. It's all part of a much bigger picture. One common theme is the Hegelian dialectic, the Hegelian philosophy. And that's where they basically pit, you take two opposites. The conflict between the two creates their opportunity. It's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or problem, reaction, solution. Neither the right nor the left, or whatever side of the opposites that they're playing against each other, is how they feel. They need to create the crisis and the conflict, and that's how they seize power. That's Hegelian dialectic, and that is the core fundamental philosophy, whether it's Marxism, whether it's Nazism or fascism, they all tie back to it's a Hegelian dialectic, and the end goal is internationalism. It is the one global order ruled by these elites, where they basically push all the buttons, and the rest of us are all just serfs, and that feeds into why we have the immigration being pushed. And we'll talk about that when we do an overview of some of the foundations. But that's really what these secret societies do, is they control society with a sleight of hand and by manipulating the public discussion. It's what we call social engineering. Tavistock Institute really started that, but these people have been doing that even longer. You see a marriage of the American secret societies and their British counterparts. The Rhodes Council, Rhodes Council worked very closely with our Council of Foreign Relations. Who founded our Council of Foreign Relations? That's a Rockefeller. Do the Rockefellers tie into any secret societies? And the answer, of course, is yes. And this whole pattern goes on and on and on with the secret societies. And in America, the people that started the secret societies, the Rockefellers don't sit at the head of the table in these council rooms. There are families that are older, if not necessarily wealthier, and they are the true blue blood Puritans of America, the Northeast, New England blue bloods. And they came over here with their Puritan idea, which is another class system. They were ripe for the Fabians coming in a couple centuries later, but you don't get into their inner circle. You are not of the right blood. I mean, this is the class system in America, and it stems straight from these, New England Puritans. And they control the institutions. They're the ones who founded every one of the colonial institutions, basically the Ivy League plus Rutgers. And I don't know if we're calling Rutgers in the Ivy League anymore. Some people still do. They control the institutions. Therefore, they control who the next generation's teachers are. And, great example of this was Thomas Dewey, basically the father of American education. Well, there's two fathers. One was Horace Mann, who was over in Prussia in the middle of the 18th century, and he brought that education system over here. And and Dewey took it and really institutionalized it. And now everybody who gets a teaching degree learns Thomas Dewey. And what was he teaching? Well, they were teaching that the state is the master. The individual doesn't matter. It was a group of collectivism, trying to get this group think. This is the social engineering stuff that we see. This is why this current day misinformation, who's running these misinformation boards? Well, it's the same NGOs and the same foundations that these same secret society inner families control. They sit on the boards of them. They're scattered throughout them. And that's how they issue this social control. And when we go through these some of these foundations, what their mission statements are, it becomes crystal clear.
I agree. I agree.
Let's take a look at one of those foundations. I got a few of them up here. I'll do a screen share. Should be working. Where's the Ford Foundation? There we go. So here's the Ford Foundation. Now let's talk about tax-free foundations first. These quote-unquote tax-free foundations in America were really first formed between the period of 1910 and 1913.
Hold on. I need to add that to the state. There you go. All right.
Oh, there you go. Well, the first two foundations were the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation. And what was going on is Rockefeller and the robber barons were so dang unpopular. They busted the trusts, Teddy Roosevelt, although he did nothing of the sort. They just reemerged in these new corporations. But what they did, first of all, these same banking Wall Street interests met on Jekyll Island to create the Federal Reserve banking system. Then in 1913, we get the 16th and 17th Amendment. One gave us the income tax, and the other took the power of taxation away from the states. Well, during that exact same period of time, they created the tax-free foundation. So all these robber barons and other deep blue blood families could hide their generational wealth behind a philanthropic enterprise. And these tax-free foundations can grow an enormous amount of wealth, all tax-free because they say they're doing it for social purposes. But I'm going to say we can demonstrate that it wasn't necessarily for good social purposes. They basically have completely distorted the idea of what a charity is.
So obviously, my research says that specifically Ford Foundation, but all of them, the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, over and over and over are funding I just did a thread yesterday on the AFL. They were getting their funding from these corporatist foundations to go down and destroy the labor unions in Latin America, because the whole reason they exported their jobs down there was to get cheap labor, and they couldn't afford to have a labor sympathetic president get elected. And so, like in Chile, they overthrew Allende. Nicaragua, they destroyed, all because they promoted a fair wage. And the whole reason those corporations had moved their workforce down there was so they could pay pennies on the dollar, while here they had people masquerading as union leaders, advocating, workers' rights and all this other stuff. Those same labor unions they created an international institute, just like what you just talked about, one of these corporate NGOs. And these foundations funneled money into it and went down and basically used it to overthrow sovereign countries.
Yeah, that's a pattern we've seen played out a few times. Just a few. So before we go into the foundations, a lot of what we know about secret societies in America, especially the Skull and Bones, which like I said, my research has been focused on, we get from three different people, and they're very important. The first one, of course, is Carroll Quigley. And, Carroll Quigley wrote the 1,400, page novel. But more specifically, he wrote another book called The Anglo-American Establishment. And he's talking about all of this. And if you don't know who Carroll Quigley was, not only was he Bill Clinton's mentor, Bill Clinton, the Rhodes Scholar, but Carroll Quigley also spent decades as the historian for the Council on Foreign Relations. And when he wrote his book, not War and Peace, it's why am I drawing a blank? I'll get it for you before we're done. When he wrote it, they were trying to keep it from being published, but the draft had already been out. So he spilled a lot of beans. So a lot of what we know came from his homework, because he basically, when you're the historian for the CFR, you know where the bodies are buried. He's seen these source documents. So His book, Anglo-American Establishment, is an absolute must-read. The next person who we really learned a lot about, who wrote about this, is the great Anthony Sutton. Now, I'm going to read a quote from him here in a second, but it's interesting how he learned about Skull and Bones. There's a woman named Charlotte Iserbyt, and what she did was she delivered to him a stack of basically the membership rolls of Skull and Bones, all in paper. Now, how did she get it? Well, her father was a Skull and Bones member. When he passed away, she got it, knew what she was looking at, and took it straight to Sutton. Well, Charlotte Iserbyt, or Iserbyt, I don't know how she pronounced it. It's Iserbyt. She's a pretty remarkable person on her own, because she wrote the book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, and she talked about how they infiltrated our education system. She was the pioneer in talking about that. And there's some great videos from her if you don't read her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America. Between Iserbyt, Sutton, and Quigley, we got some really good source information.
I think Tragedy and Hope is the name of the book.
Thank you. Why? I won't. I have it. I've read it. I read it once, and I've done the audiobook twice, and I still always draw a blank on that name. There's a neat little quote I wanted to read. And this is from Anthony C. Sutton. This is why I think this is so important. I've got the PDF book right here, so let me do the screen share again. Okay, is this big enough to read?
Not really. Go ahead and read it.
Oops, well, I just changed the page. All right, here's the foreword to his book about Skull and Bones. It goes, after 16 books and 25 years in basic research, Anthony Sutton was a professor at Stanford University, worked with the Hoover Foundation. Very well, highly regarded historian. He did his work in the late 60s, early 70s, when a lot of other truths were coming out. He goes, after 16 books and 25 years in basic research, I thought I'd heard it all. The world was a confused mess, probably beyond understanding and certainly beyond salvation, and there was little I could do about it. Back in 1968, my Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development was published by the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. This is the books he wrote that we talked about how U.S. industry helped prop up the Soviet Union. We gave them technology. We gave them weapons. He's the one who exposed that. He goes, in 3 substantial volumes, I detailed how the West had built the Soviet Union. However, the work generated a seemingly insoluble puzzle. Why have we done this? Why did we build the Soviet Union while we also transferred technology to Hitler's Germany? Why does Washington want to conceal those facts? Why have we boosted Soviet military power and simultaneously boosted our own? Good questions. In subsequent books, the Wall Street series, we talked about the Wall Street connection to both Hitler and the Soviets. I added more questions, but no answers. I had more or less arrived at the conclusion that there was no rational answer that could be proven. Then a year ago, I received an 8-inch batch of documents, nothing less than the membership lists of an American secret society. Glancing through the sheets, it was more than obvious this was no ordinary group. The name spelled power with a capital P. As I probed each individual, a pattern emerged, and a formerly fuzzy world became crystal clear. This book you will read here is a combined version of a series reporting on the research. Each volume builds on the previous volume in a logical step-by-step process. Anyways, that is Mr. Sutton, and how he basically went from not quite understanding how these pieces fit to saying, aha, now I get it. And what he was seeing was all these different Skull and Bones members put in positions where they could influence, both domestic and international affairs, and in a way that he previously couldn't understand the logic behind it. And he'll get in there and talk about the Hegelian dialectic quite a bit, because now he understood what their motivations were.
And what's interesting that comes out in his trilogy of the Wall Street and the Bolsheviks, Wall Street Hitler, Wall Street FDR, is when they say that there's a secret hand, that is manipulating everything, what we refer to as the international syndicate, I always look at that as the control of the marionette puppet. And so that is the secret hand. It's up, out of the way. Most people do not see the strings attached on purpose. And what you are watching is a play. And I have always thought, for those people out there that talk about you're watching a show, I don't think it was ever meant for what's going on right now. I think it was meant for our entire life. We have been watching a show our entire life. Everything is orchestrated. Everything is on a stage, and it's a performance, and it's orchestrated by this private hand, which is the secret societies.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I call my series of the shows we've done together, the shadow state. Those are the puppet masters. They're in the shadows, in the dark, smoky rooms. Some of the names you get to know, some of them we don't. Some of them are, hidden in plain sight.
Correct.
So should I jump into the foundations? Because I think it's fascinating.
Well, let me mention that we're going to go, as part of this series in the future, we will spend a couple of shows talking about another, what I find equally interesting as the Skull and Bones, but is never mentioned, called the Ritchie Boys. And the Ritchie Boys, while there are some overlap, and I do believe that's on purpose. So as you say, they provide they're like the gatekeepers, if you will, or the coordinators. The fact that the Skull and Bones produces people that's going to be distributed out to these other secret societies, and it's not, Ritchie Boy probably doesn't register as an official society, but it functioned as one. And because of and for those of you who don't know, it was a camp that was set up in Maryland for World War II. It took people out of the immigrant population, put them through an intelligence paramilitary training, and deployed them to their former countries as spies as part of OSS. And because the area of contention was Eastern Germany, Western Russia, a lot of these people, the preponderance of them, were Jewish, and they spoke Russian. A lot of them spoke German. And as a result of that, they were the perfect spies. And so you have this entire collective that, after the war, having been intelligence assets, permeated, just like the Skull and Bones, into every one of the corporations, the foundations, and you find them everywhere. But they have this connection that they communicate with each other and function as a secret society.
I wouldn't be surprised if they got their secret handshakes and everything like that too. That would not be. That'll be a fun episode. I've actually started building a folder on Ritchie Boys research, so I will be able to contribute on that one.
Awesome.
So let's look at our foundation. I just think this is hilarious. So Ford Foundation. Now, interesting thing about the Ford Foundation is everyone knows about the Ford family. They're not really in control of their own foundation. It's these other Skull and Bone members, alumni, and related people that sit on the boards of directors. And we'll get to that in a second. And I think the same is the case for the Carnegies. They have almost no power of their own foundation. But so we have this generational wealth in the billions going behind these charitable foundations. And what are they actually doing? So if we go to Ford's work, first hour, we are disrupting systems to advance social justice. That's on their homepage. They are bringing the social justice warriors. They have been doing this by funding the universities for decades. That's where this whole social justice, all this stuff comes from, these foundations.
They are funding the foot soldiers or jackboots to stir up political unrest in every country, including the United States.
Yeah, because they want to create the false dichotomy of right versus left. That's why you see the social justice warriors cheering that a CEO of a life insurance company was assassinated. They're taught to be anti-establishment by having no idea that it's the establishment that's manipulating them.
Exactly. But that is the Hegelian dialect right there.
Exactly. And we're just going to keep that. If you haven't read about Hegel, people, we'll probably need to do a primer on it, but it's very important to understand it. Next one they have is we invest in transformative ideas, individuals, and institutions. Well, what does that mean? That's another one of those buzzwords. We're
Well,
reimagining philanthropy.
they're reimagining it into paramilitary activity, and their transformational ideas is to take stable democracies and turning them into hellholes for the international syndicate. So every bit of that is true. It's just not the way it appears.
Let's take a look at their priorities. We believe inequality is at the root of nearly every injustice. To create meaningful, lasting change, we focus on 9 interconnected ideas. You have the civic engagement in government. That's basically Soros. Creativity and free expression. Well, that's the breakdown of morals. Of course, we have to have disability rights. Got to have a cause. Future of workers, which I would imagine has to do with labor to some degree.
But co-opted labor, not real labor rights.
Gotcha. Here's a big one. Where did it come from? Gender, racial, and ethnic justice. These are the billionaires, casting, their tax-free profits. And the money they're giving in the form of grants is going to our institutes of higher learning. And if you don't go along with this as a professor, you're not getting funded. These
Correct.
People control the cash register. Of course, they go on to talk about global governance, straight out of the World Economic Forum.
Because it's all about one world government.
Yeah. Mission investments obviously are going to have something to do with climate initiatives, which you see in the next one, natural resources and climate change. Once again, it's a way of seizing resources. And of course, they want to have their fingers on the pulse of technology and society. I mean, it basically, it's about as damning of a page as you could ever want.
Well, and understand where they put technology and society. Because technology is used to control society.
Let's take a quick look at their board of trustees. There's some interesting people on there. The ones who jump off all these are going to be who's who people that have showed up at Davos. They've done very well in academia. Perhaps they've started successful companies, or they've just been running NGOs. It's all the same circle of the same cocktail party. Lauren Powell Jobs. Interesting. Henry Ford III still sits on the board. Lucky him.
And Henry Ford III has been involved in Operation Gladio events, just like Kermit Roosevelt and many of the Peter Grace of W.R. Grace, all known CIA, at least assets, if not agents.
Not a shocker at all there. You'll see this one here, Ajin Pu. She's the president of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. That's got to be union-based. And these are all the different quote-unquote stakeholders in these foundations. And that's where you get this stakeholder capitalism. All these different, if you're part of let's say a grassroots labor rights organization, you've got maybe 10,000 boots you can put on the ground. Well, where do you think these rent-a-mobs come from? That's exactly how they work together. They've got their own foot soldiers. We have a George H. Walker, and yes, he is related to the Walkers in the Bushes. I did check.
Yes, he is.
You can see it in his face. This guy absolutely looks like a Bush. He's chairman of Neuberger Berman, a very large investment firm. And you can go through all of these, but it's the same pattern. They're all part of the same circuit. Shall we do another?
Sure.
Who do I have here? How about we do the Carnegies? That's a good one. From the Carnegie Foundation, improving educational outcomes. Now, you're going to see a lot of their focus is on education. That's what the Carnegies got into. The future of learning. Carnegie is working to reimagine the educational landscape to promote engaging, rigorous, and equitable learning experiences for all young people. Now, what I find interesting about that, Colonel, is they're already in control over the whole education system through Dewey and Mann. So what are they reimagining? They've already put their system in place. You've got the post-secondary innovation, same kind of gobbledygook, measuring what matters. The Carnegie created the credit hour, which serves as the bedrock currency of the educational economy. The big thing they did with education is with the Carnegie Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation, that basically came in there, created and took over the FDA. They changed the way medical schools taught. No longer would you get any kind of holistic medicine being taught. They were considered quacks. And instead, in their place, we created an army of doctors educated to push petroleum-based pharmaceuticals. Now, who had control of the petroleum? Of course, that would have been the Rockefellers. And they did this to our education. See if I can take a look at their board real quick. I think there's some good names here. Jorge Aguilar. There's some good ones. Oh, Yo-Yo Ma, the founder of Silk Road. Big Chinese connection here. You're going to see a lot of cooperation between these endeavors and the CCP with these foundations. We've talked about this before, but I'll touch on it again. It was Rockefeller and his stooges were the ones who went over there and opened up China in the first place. It was Rockefeller stooge Klaus Schwab who started the World Economic Forum. It was Rockefeller stooge Maurice Strong who started the entire man-made global warming, global cooling, climate change scam. These people all came from the foundations. They're pushing the same ideas, and you got to ask yourself why.
For control.
Well, it's exactly right. The resources, and we talked a while back about how they're using this ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement Program. So basically, corporations could sue sovereign nations on their own territory. Yeah, it's pretty bad.
That's actually, do you think it's fair to say that's like an extortion program? Do it our way, or we're going to use this court system, which is bogus because it shouldn't have control over a foreign government. But what they do is it's a bullying technique that they can say they have it. And then they use the economic strength of the dollar to say, you're not going to get IMF or World Bank or anybody else's money because you owe us money. And it's literally like the old version of the mafia coming and shaking you up.
Well, it's exactly right. And here's a fun fact. The first international court was founded in 1920 by the American Society for the Judicial Settlement of International Disputes. It was an international court of law, which had no jurisdiction. You want to know who their first chairman was? Yeah, that would have been William Howard Taft, bonesman, son of a bonesman, and the only man ever to be both president of the United States and sit on the Supreme Court. He's the guy who started the international court system. So you're exactly right about what it is. Fun one, huh?
Well, I find it interesting that most of the operations, so there were some skeleton parts of it that was put together after the First World War I, but the majority of the hard-hitting ones that are like kind of, how you have like the central bank, the BIS was set up between World War I and II. And then you have the World Bank and IMF, which was kind of like your local branches in a normal way of thinking of. Almost every single facet of their vision of world government, some foot in the door happened after World War I. And then it was exploded after World War II into the actual mechanisms to control.
Yeah, and it really did take on it, went into warp speed after World War II. And I think part of that came down to, we downsized the military after World War I, as we're constitutionally are supposed to. We're not supposed to have a standing army.
Correct.
Well, that went out the door right after World War II. Our military did not get smaller. In fact, that's where the military-industrial complex came from. And there's an argument to be made that might have been necessary. We didn't get out of the Great Depression in the 30s until we basically nationalized the U.S. economy. So we get down to World War II, we've created a wartime economy, and the powers that be actually had the conversation. Look, if we downsize our military, the rest of the world's been destroyed, bombed to smithereens. We have no customers. Our factory's going to have to go back smaller. Or we can create this thing called the Marshall Plan, where we basically influence events all over the world because we have the money, we have the monetary controls after Bretton Woods. We've got the Gladio operations in place to make sure the governments go the way we want. And we can basically turn Europe and parts of Asia into consumers of our products and keep our wartime industry just as high as it was. Well, that was fine economically, but what did that do for the power structure? And
So the Marshall Plan, I've ran across lots of, especially with Paul Williams and Danielle Ganser's books, that the Marshall Plan was necessary in order to provide the initial seed money to launder into creating the military industrial complex covertly to jumpstart financing Chiang Kai-shek over in, at the time, southern China, pulling him out, relocating him. And they had already planned to do what they did in Korea. There were people planning to take over the opium trade via Vietnam from France, which is why we insisted France had to go back into Vietnam instead of allowing Ho Chi Minh to set up his own unified country. So you have this long drawn out war scenario that started post-war, because, you know, we went into the Korean War in 1950 and we had 2 skirmishes before that. So there was a perpetuation. And the only way that they could make the argument to justify those expenditures and the anti-communist boogeyman was to turn the Soviet Union into the boogeyman overnight.
And it worked.
And it worked.
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting. You ask, I was thinking about this morning when I was reviewing some of the Sutton stuff. You know, how do you justify, you know, financing the far right Nazis and the far left, using their term far right and left, far left Bolsheviks? How do you justify, how does that wash unless you have something else in mind? And obviously they do. The Rockefellers, my poster child for this whole story. They do some interesting work. Oops, I think that's it. I'll start with their work. The Rockefeller Foundation works on health, food, power, U.S. economic opportunity, innovation, and innovative finance. Where do they work? Pretty much all over the world, with a specific emphasis in Italy. Well, their grants are interesting. Where does the money go? You can search their grants and find out where, you know, all over the place, different places. Obviously, they have to file public forms. A lot of money goes to Columbia University. They finance an awful lot of the Ivy League programs. And again, if you teach something that doesn't fit their narrative, you're not going to get the funding. You're not going to get tenure. If you're a researcher, they fund the science. If you're not researching what they want you to do, the checkbook's going to be closed.
Well, and you have the cereal growers up there too. They control all modern farming, which is why we have so many GMO.
Yeah, absolutely.
They began that down in their test project for that was South America with Nelson Rockefeller.
Yeah, and you see them talking about climate change, of course. They're all in on board on that. You know, it doesn't matter if it's global warming, global cooling, because the solution's always been the same.
No, it's a money laundering opportunity.
Absolutely. And these people know darn well. What's interesting that you got to remember the Rockefeller money came from oil, petroleum, fossil fuels. So why are they, you know, pushing a narrative to get rid of fossil fuels unless it's to create scarcity or power? It certainly isn't to make more money.
Well, it's control. I mean, it's always about control. They have to take our resources so they can control us. They can't provide us with anything cheap to make our lives more abundant because then they can't control us.
Well, it explains the entire no nukes movement from the 70s and 80s. Nuclear power had a lot of potential. And, you know, look, I don't care how someone feels about carbon emissions or not. That's a moot point for what I'm about to say. It is undeniable that the fossil fuel technology has lifted more people out of poverty than all other inventions humankind has ever put together.
Which is why it cannot be allowed to exist.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Their board of trustees has some fun ones. Can you still see that?
Yes. So let me just, I have to say this because this is a foot stomper for me. People think that the Rockefellers went around to control the oil to get themselves rich. They didn't. Oil provided the avenue for everybody in the world to have a good life. They control oil to control us, not to get rich. It has nothing to do with money. It has everything to do with control. Oil gets us rich because we can provide the utility and the innovation to transfer cheap transportation and resources to solve problems. If you don't have access to that, you're dead in the water. And if they control it all, I mean, that we just went over the fact that the whole Middle East during Carter administration was all manipulated by big oil. The whole, oh my God, we're out of gasoline, long lines in the 1970s was all to thwart Carter to get him out of office. If you control oil, you control the world. And they're not controlling oil to get themselves rich. That was never what it was about. It was to control us because oil provides us the ability and the infrastructure to be able to make our lives better.
Yeah, and you look who controlled the oil when oil first got going. You had three main global energy companies, and it was Standard Oil with the Rockefellers here. It was Royal Dutch Shell, which was a lot of the European, still owned by some of the, I believe, the Dutch oils.
Dutch Empire.
Yeah, and then of course you had the British Petroleum, which is a partner, of course, with Aramco in Saudi Arabia.
The British Empire.
Yes. I mean, and they have wielded the tools of empire, and this is one of them, natural resources.
A monopoly of it for control.
Absolutely. And, well, I'm not going to jump into that right now, but how the robber barons came about is a big part of the story, and it's about using the levers of government to finance private activity. Save that story for another day. Let's take a look at that board of trustees, though, because this is a fun one. This is the Rockefeller Foundation, what may be one of the most powerful in the world. I'd say the Rhodes Foundation probably has as much international power, but it's close. First one, their board chair is a guy by the name of Admiral James Stavridis, U.S. Navy retired. So military involved.
And that should scare the hell out of everybody.
Yeah, this guy's supposed to be a trained warfighter, and yet he's sitting on a board of directors of people that are socially engineering, the world.
Guess where else he sits?
Where does he sit right now?
I've looked at him a lot. He's on the Carlyle Group.
Big sucker there.
Okay, so understand that the Carlyle Group, we were just talking about big oil. The Carlyle Group was set up by James Baker, George Bush, all of the what they label as conservative international syndicate, which they are not, crime family. And you have Dick Cheney, all of those types of people that were in the Carlyle Group. What they did is after Bush Sr. being Intel got out of the presidency, he formed the Carlyle Group. The Carlyle Group went around and bought lots of interest in military industrial complex companies. And they all got rich off of starting all of the wars that are going to start after the 91 war. And I do mean all of the regional conflicts, selling arms to Israel for all of their wars, selling arms everywhere, sneaking arms into countries that we don't even know happened unless you're up on Operation Gladio. Then, going back to our BCCI series, you have the same people that were involved financially in BCCI buying a minority interest in the Carlyle Group from the Saudi Arabian princes, right? So they collectively come up with almost 25% at one point. And some people have said it's even more, but I've seen 25 used a lot. And so there's a lot of speculation that was kind of a quid pro quo for 9/11, for allowing them to be blamed for 9/11, was they're buying in. And I want people to understand that we have a military to military sales program with Saudi Arabia. We have a foreign aid program with Saudi Arabia. So your tax dollars are going to Saudi Arabia for them to turn around and buy weapon systems from the military industrial complex, of which they're a 25% owner of. So they're making money off of your taxes.
And it's hiding behind a tax-free foundation.
Correct.
Which is interesting. And you brought up something important about the people that sit on multiple boards, whether it be corporate boards of directors, these NGOs or these foundations. When you're part of the connected group, you will basically you will get paid to warm up a seat on many, many boards. And a lot of these people are nothing but seat warmers. But you see this, it's the same families, connections, secret organizations that are infiltrated throughout these, and they are the ones who basically dominate American culture because they control the institutions.
And let me drop one more before we move on. Do you know Barack Obama's first appointment for the NATO commander, which controls Operation Gladio, was this guy right here?
Big shocker.
He was the NATO commander for 4 years under Barack Obama. And from 2006 to 2009, he was the SOCOM commander. And what's the SOCOM? I'm sorry, not SOCOM, Southcom. What's the Southcom commander do? He provides military assistance for all the drug trafficking, helping the CIA get all the drugs from Latin America into the United States. I know that's not on their official mission document, but that's exactly what they do. They provide all of the training for Colombian terrorists and paramilitary to help shuttle the drugs into the United States, because they sure as hell don't stop them. This guy right here is a criminal. And the thing that pisses me off about that guy actually is a criminal. And then you have these morons going after General Flynn who tried to stop it all. This guy's a criminal.
You don't have to sell me on that.
Okay. We can go on.
Yeah, some other fun names. Of course, Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. It's a pretty prominent name to have on there. This one next to him is an Agnes Binagwaho. Binagwaho, I think is pronounced. Best I can do. My apologies. She's the Vice Chancellor of the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda. Now, what do we know about these global health initiatives in Africa? They've been experimenting with vaccines on the population without their knowledge.
Yes.
This ties into the Gates Foundation stuff. Rockefeller Foundation is obviously involved in that. And yes. I don't think we need to scratch our heads too hard to ask why.
Nope.
A couple other fun names on this board. Oh, Sharon Percy Rockefeller.
Gordon Brown?
Uh-huh. Former Prime Minister, sits on the Rockefeller Foundation. This is the retirement plan for politicians who have been cooperative. You get to sit on boards of directors making six-figure salaries and going to plush cocktail parties and shaking hands and hobnobbing it with the global elite. That's your reward. That's your reward for being a good politician.
Right, but you're also funding the destruction of all of us around the world by sitting on that board.
Yeah, and it's even, it's the fact they're funding it. You take taxpayer dollars, they pump it. Oh, we'll do a public-private partnership with this foundation, so they give them a bunch of money while this foundation is sitting behind a tax shelter. The foundation, if there's any profits, it goes back to the foundation, not the government. And then you turn around for doing that word for whether for a corporation or for a foundation. Then you get this rewarded by sitting on the board of directors. It's a nice gig if you can get it.
So I also see the African Development Bank, which is in collusion with not actually developing Africa, but controlling the corrupt people that the international syndicate installs in Africa.
Yep, indeed. There was another one. There was more. Oh, Adam Silver, commissioner.
Wow, I was going to say, are you kidding me?
Yeah. Have you noticed? Have you noticed how the NBA bends over backwards for China?
Yes.
They fired a general manager of the Houston Rockets because he was critical of, he was supportive of the Hong Kong resistance a few years back, and the NBA, China almost shut down the NBA. You saw everyone from Coach Steve Kerr to LeBron James doing everything in their power to be as pro-China as you could ever ask, even a Chinese politician to be. And that's coming from Adam Silver.
Okay, go on up a little bit. Now, I want to say about Juan Manuel Santos. No, he's right there on that same line, first one. Former president of Colombia. What did I just tell you about Southcom? In Colombia alone, there are over 20,000 trained paramilitary assassins, thanks to Southcom, the guy up at the top, funding the training of paramilitary forces in Colombia under the guise of the war on drugs. What we found out is that those trained paramilitary people are being rented by the UN and NATO, same guy up top, by the way, to go and deploy to do things like Syria. These same people from Latin America were deployed to places in the 80s, like in Angola. They were moved all over to attack the Nicaraguans. They've been used all over the world. You find them everywhere. And there's over 20,000 of them trained, ready to deploy anywhere on notice by NATO or the UN. And then who's the last guy there?
Ravi Venkatesan. He is the special representative for young people and innovation at UNICEF.
Yes. And what did we know about UNICEF?
Boy, they got caught in a cookie jar delivering some aid, and I'm trying to remember the specific story. So why don't you take that one?
So there's actually several stories about UNICEF, and they basically function as, so I know this is going to step on a lot of toes, but one of the things that I found is organizations that we think are good, like the YMCA, was actually infiltrated and used as a quote unquote Christian ministry. And then people that were actual volunteers in the YMCA program were deployed and then used, not to their knowledge in many cases, but they were used to infiltrate and spy on foreign countries. UNICEF people are infested with intelligence assets that use the auspices of UNICEF's program in order to go into foreign countries and gather intelligence. And they specifically prey on little children, where you end up with AmeriCare coming in and all of their subordinate national children's affiliations that, in the case of AmeriCare, apparently is alleged to have been kidnapping the little kids. Not good.
Yeah, it's Hegelian dialectic. You set up a foundation or an NGO ostensibly to do one thing while you're doing just the opposite.
Exactly.
Yeah. And you'll notice these people come from all over the world. This is not an American problem. This is a global problem. There are boards of directors. There are foundations. A lot of them come from America or England, but they're everywhere. And every country's got their own little elite clique of the people that have their own cocktail parties, and they all do it for the playing the great global Game of Thrones. But it's not just one foundation or one secret society. It's many of them, and they work together. And that's exactly why I use terms like the shadow state, and the Colonel calls it, the international syndicate, because it's exactly what it is. It's the John Wick world that we actually live under, with a little bit less violence in the open. That's probably good for showing what the foundations do and introducing the connections.
I want to jump off of what you just said about them being everywhere in other countries. When it's been a while, I had it on a list, but since we decided to do this, there was what is referred to as a secret society, but most people it would not fit our traditional definition of a secret society. But I found it fascinating because you guys know that I've done a lot of deep digging into Southeast Asia, into the KMT Chiang Kai-shek involvement in Operation Gladio. Well, I came across a term that, until we decided to do the show, I had not really did a lot of research in. And we're not going to go into depth. This is just an intro for a future show. And if you guys are interested, I'm going to mention it here. We'll close out the show. And then again, this is going to be a continuing. I want you guys to be familiar with the term Chinese tongues, TONGS. It is referred to in China and in Chinese communities in America as a secret society. And I want to tell you the thing that I found most fascinating about it is that its development initially in China was in the same area that gave birth to the KMT army in Chiang Kai-shek, which of course is why it made it on my list to come back and look at it later. It is intricately mingled with the China lobby, which we've covered extensively, which is intimately mingled with the CIA and Operation Gladio because of Chiang Kai-shek and the Reverend Moon's incorporation into the World Anti-Communist League and blah, blah, blah. So it just kind of is like a growing trend there. But most of the normal journalists in America introduces or talks about the Chinese Tongs as like a town hall where there were immigrant officials that helped people coming over here, because back in the 1800s, they came over here to work in mines and all kinds of labor. They were basically the Mexicans of the 1800s, for lack of a better way of saying that.
Well, we got rid of our slavery. We had to hire someone almost as cheap. That's what.
Correct.
That's how we built the railroads.
Correct. So you have these people, Chinese people coming over here. Well, it was mysteriously military-aged men, that thing. And they were used primarily at that time in the West in mining, ranching, that type of thing. So these halls that formed like in the Los Angeles area and the San Francisco area and everything became the house. While it looked like a legitimate office when you walked in, if you walked through the back door, it was gambling, prostitution. They snuck women. They actually had human trafficking going on in the 1800s, where they trafficked illegally Chinese women into the United States to service these workers in all of these mining towns throughout Montana and all of these other things. And the first thing I told my husband when I was reading this, I'm like, oh, is that who Hop Sing was on Bonanza? I'm like, well, that makes perfect sense on why they would be there. And again, just a little subtle thing, but those kind of things actually start clicking up. And I want to read you a quote. It says, these people come from the area and have to do with the opium. Here's a quote. It says, it is now also generally recognized that Chiang Kai-shek's seizure of both the KMT and China, initially before he was kicked out and lost to Mao, was achieved with the help of opium trafficking green gangs. And it mutually benefited the U.S. and Chiang Kai-shek. By the mid-1930s, China was producing 7/8 of the world's opium supply, and some of it came to the Chinese Tongs in America. So they were dealing drugs out of these town halls that most reporters reported were just legitimate, kind of gathering places in Chinatown. And they were intimately associated with Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano. So that's just a tease for upcoming shows.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that one. It'll tie into a series I've been watching called Empires of Silver, and we'll be complimentary on that one too. Well, today we've really talked about what these secret societies do, how they basically manipulate every aspect of society. Next week, I think we're going to dive into Skull and Bones. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, we'll go. So what you're going to see when we go into these individuals with specific names and show you where they worked and when and who they worked with, all the connections, everything we've just said today, it's going to become so crystal clear, and it's just a spider web. And hopefully I can do it graphically in such a way that it really does it justice. I'd like to close with a quote from the book from Anthony Sutton. And he says, the evolution of American society is not and has not been for more than a century a voluntary development reflecting independent individual ideas and decisions at the grassroots. On the contrary, the broad direction has been created artificially and stimulated by the order. And by the order, he means skull and bones.
Amen.
So that's what we're going to jump into next week. A little more, get a lot more granular, and boy, this could go for another. This is going to be a fun series. I have no idea how long it's going to take us to get everything, but I'm game.
Me too. And thank you for sharing all of your knowledge. I know you put a lot of effort into the research, and I'm looking forward to it too.
Excellent. Until the next time, thanks everyone for watching.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.